From excessive spending to overreaching regulations, many Americans think that Congress should be reined in, and our next guest is a sponsor of the REINS Act. This is a bill that would require Congress to take an up or down vote on every single major rule that could cost small businesses out there and the economy $100 million or more. So will this make Congress more accountable and stop too much power being given to agency bureaucrats? Republican Congressman Geoff Davis of Kentucky joins us now from Cincinnati. It's a great idea, Congressman. Congratulations. But first of all, how do you price regulations? Who does that?
Well, regulations are scored by the Office of Management and Budget, an organization called OIRA. Inside that, I think we ought to have some parallel scoring coming from outside of that, although that's not the focus of the bill. But one thing that's clear, the Constitution empowers the legislative branch with the power of the purse to oversee the executive branch and hold it accountable. And over the past 60 years, with the growth of the regulatory state, there's been so much drift, and now we're seeing agencies literally ignore the will of Congress. We've seen that with the move to bring about cap and trade, card check, net neutrality, which was not what the American people wanted. And this simply is a means that's constitutional to reinforce that. When we're levying on small communities, billion-dollar consent decrees by the Environmental Protection Agency, when No Child Left Behind levies huge unfunded mandates on our schools, dealing with telecommunications or business regulations.
But let me just stop you there if I can, Congressman, because I got to ask, would this have any effect on what, for example, as you mentioned before, the EPA has been doing, that is using its regulatory powers to sort of overstep Congress? Would it put any onus on them to account for their regulations?
Absolutely. In fact, if we get this into law, they would have to send that bill after scoring, or that regulation after scoring for cap and trade, up to the Capitol Hill for an up or down vote in the House and in the Senate on a joint resolution and be signed by the President. I can tell you that would not pass. It didn't pass in a dominated liberal Congress, and it certainly wouldn't pass now. And this is really an end run around the will of the American people. What REINS does is provides transparency, accountability, and most importantly, checks and balances. It's not anti-regulation, but it will have a clear dialogue between the regulators in the administration and whoever happens to be in power in Congress, so the American people have someone to hold accountable.
Do you have any Democrats on board this with you?
Not yet. We're going to have quite a few. I understand Mrs. Pelosi has not been supportive of this because she saw it as an attack on the administration. The reality is there were plenty of us that had issue with regulatory increases in the Bush administration. And what this does is provides an outlet for us to provide transparency and accountability to get that vote, regardless of who's in power, and ultimately give that back to the American people. I believe we'll have plenty of Democrats in short order, though.
You know, the reason I ask is because Senator George McGovern, of course, ran for president years ago back in the 70s. He actually left the Senate, went and started a small business on his own, a little inn that he bought in the state of Connecticut, and he went bankrupt, partly because of some of the rules that he actually voted on when he was in the Senate. And he said if he'd known how these rules actually affected businesses, he never would have voted in favor of them. So at least that's one Democrat. There are some Democrats who are open to this idea.
Well, there are numerous Democrats who come from a business background, a small business background, who understand this, in the Blue Dog Caucus among the new Democrats, and I'm very hopeful that we'll pick up quite a number of them. The real issue here is bringing some context to regulations, scalability, and making sure that vague legislation is not the output simply to pass something like we saw in financial reg reform and health care. It opened a Pandora's box that is, in effect, legislating and taxing by regulation from these agencies. And if we're going to maintain any cohesiveness in our republic, this is a very simple way to restore that.
Yeah, and I love the idea, particularly if you're able to score it by business groups as well as folks in the government. It'd be a terrific idea. It forces Congress to pay attention to what's happening in the business world for what they do. It's a great idea. Geoff Davis, we got to leave it at that. Thanks for joining us. Have a great weekend.
Great to be with you.
Coming up on deck, so much for the new climate of civil